1330 Terran Front fleet time. On the Turinika homeworld, the first signs of unrest began to manifest like a wave. The broadcast of the most esteemed Tizikikoonazikiakakiatkata, Taratanti of the roost Kazatalak, openly performing the act of Kavsa, had been met with shock. The last Taratanti who had voluntarily performed Kavsa had done so in protest of the treatment of the Kulorn caste, nearly 2,000 years prior. It was an ancient rite, one that signified rejection of the greatest shame. Even more shocking than the act itself was the evidence that had followed it. Visuals of species, brought into the Conclave, not as migrant workers as had been believed, but as slaves, was met with an almost immediate attempt at censorship. This attempt failed spectacularly, mostly due to those who had been tasked to censor the information not only refusing to follow the command, but openly declaring that they had been ordered to do so. A situation that was already, as the humans would say, out of hand, spiraled completely out of control. Within only 20 minutes of the ending of Tizikikoonazikiakakiatkata's broadcast, entire cities entered a state of absolute anarchy. 2 planetary capitals were stormed and taken by the furious civilian population, demanding the location of those who had been enslaved. The Turinika Armada, which even then was in the middle of a training session meant to prepare the fleet to withstand the Terran Front's assault, began to cease operations. Within the hour, the entire armada would be recalled to the Turinika homeworld. Those who did not take to the streets simply stopped whatever work they were doing and went to their homes to be around their brood. Images of Tizikikoonazikiakakiatkata with his stripped wings spread wide in front of the human fleet commander were on every news feed of the Conclave, as was the sound of his thunderous voice, and the wails of despair from a Turinika female that couldn't be seen. Close-ups of the human fleet commander's face were shown, with analysts remarking on the shock, horror, and sympathy. Since the outbreak of the Seventh Orion War, the female human known as Simmons had been reported to have made several threats towards the Turinika. She had quickly become seen as a warmonger, ready to take revenge against the Turinika for refusing to go to war and violate their principles of pacifism. Now the images of her lunging forward to stop the violation of Tizikikoonazikiakakiatkata's plumage, the agonized expression on her face, and the true reason for her threats against the Turinika were rapidly reversing her image. On far-flung deep-core mining stations and agricultural stations, on deep space stations dedicated to material processing, and in other areas hidden from the sight of the normal Turinican population, overseers and taskmasters felt their hearts run cold at the knowledge that very soon their part to play in the willful enslavement of another species would be known to the wider Conclave. As the data package transmitted alongside the broadcast was fully decompressed and the scale of the Conclave's government's involvement was revealed, the entirety of the Conclave itself was teetering on the verge of absolute pandemonium. The image of a member of the Kulorn species, from the look of it barely a hatchling, quickly was becoming the face of the entire incident. The picture was absolutely damning, and the sight of the image had sent any who saw it instantly into contorting and painful displays of shame. The young Kulorn was sprawled on its stomach, looking to the one taking its picture with eyes that had no life in them. Its shell covered its back, and despite the age of the Kulorn, it was already dulled and scuffed. The foot pressing down on the shell was unmistakably familiar to those who saw it, the clawed feet of a Turinika. Within the hour, billions of winged figures stood in streets, the normally soft-spoken and passive species demanding action, demanding justice, on the 100 worlds of the Turinika Conclave. The bulk of the Taratanti caste, most of whom had been left in the dark of the truth of the situation, quickly went public with their own declaration of outrage, and the eyes of the entire species turned inwards to the mountainous homeworld of their species. Hakuri Watanabe looked down at his helmet before putting it on his bed, the stylized 7 seeming to stare at him. He sat down in his chair and picked up a small cloth from his buffing kit. No one knocked on his door, in fact. Mostly he and the rest of his squad were left alone before a major operation. They were just given their time to mentally prepare. Some of his squad would go over their mission briefing. Some, like him, would spend their time doing something to relax themselves. Hakuri always found that taking care of his suit calmed him considerably. Granted, he could simply turn it over to the squad's armorers to be tended to, and they would do as good of a job as he could, but he preferred it to be done by his own hand. The symbol of a triangle was on his form-fitting shirt, the symbol of his Special Operations Command Unit. He was known as a Myrmidon, but the official title of his unit was Section 3. He knew this, his superiors knew this, and as far as Hakuri knew, most of the Terran Front was aware of his unit's existence, but past that, they knew very little about what he actually did. As far as his mother knew, Hakuri was a pencil pusher on board the TFS Berlin, the troop mothership that all of his letters were sent from. He thought about writing her, but then again, he only liked to do that when he returned from a mission, not when he was expecting to go to one. If he tried to write her when he was waiting, he would just get anxious and homesick. That wouldn't do when he was dropping into a combat zone. That wouldn't do at all. Hakuri instead started to buff his helmet, waiting for the word to come down, which meant they were prepared to jump. A glance at the clock made him pause in his circular rotations. The clock said 13:30. Operation Naked Sun was about to begin. Tika was on his side, Kazia standing at the end of the medical bed that had been adjusted for his Turinican physiology. He felt cold in more ways than one. For his people, clothing was more of a decoration than a necessity, but without his protective plumage, he felt the cold stabbing him through to his hollow bones. His diplomatic access was already gone, his privileged access revoked. He heard the broadcast for a preparation to jump. But he wasn't truly listening. There was no question in his mind he had made the right decision. There was no question at all. One of the humans, a nurse, came to his side and gently laid a heavy blanket over him. The human's hand lingered on his trembling body for a few moments before it was removed, and Tika glanced in their direction. The female was one of the ones who had responded first to the call for medical service for him, had heard what had happened and why. Tika had gotten very used to being glared at on this ship. He was hated and he knew it. He knew he had deserved it. He was a party to the Vral's enslavement of the humans, the Chua, and far too many others. When he had come to Thermopylae Station, he had not even given that fact a single thought. He was born into power, being of the Taratanti. He belonged to the most powerful species and government in the entire quadrant of the galaxy. His people, while mighty, did not seek to use it. To him, they had simply been above it all. When the Vral had approached him with the offer to sell captured species at first, Tika had wanted to reject it out of hand, but a few had told him to go through with the sale. Such was the nature of this galaxy, or so he had believed. The weak were at the whims of the strong, and one's place in the galaxy was determined only by the power they could wield. The Turinika were not nearly the first to have taken a species and used it for slave labor, and while Tika did not approve of the deal, he had not fought it either. As he looked back to the wall, he remembered what the humans had taught him these last days. When he had arrived at Thermopylae, he had assumed he would find the Chua species to have been at the very least regulated to a subservient role, if not outright enslaved. Finding them sharing power was a curiosity. He had expected to be treated with all the honor and dignity that his station demanded, that the power of his government demanded. Fleet Marshal Simmons had disabused him of that and had left him humiliated and shamed. As he had laid in the dark as Simmons had declared the Seventh Orion War, covered in his own filth, feeling as if at any moment he was going to be killed, he knew true fear and horrific uncertainty for the first time in his life. He had never faced these emotions, these sensations before. He had always been in power. He had stood with the full might of the Turinika Conclave behind him. He had never known anything other than the superior position. Now, as he lay in the hospital bed staring at the wall, he was ashamed of how arrogant, how blind, and how short-sighted he had been. After he had risen from his own filth, he had desperately tried to convince his leadership of the strength of the Terran Front, how it matched or eclipsed their own. The Conclave was not the unchallenged power in the quadrant anymore. The Terrans, the human and Chua, had somehow defied fate. They had not fallen to the Vral after 90 years of near-constant conflict, and now, if Tika was right, they had come out of it nightmarishly stronger than before. Tika had actually begged to be heard by his superiors, and he had never come close to that once in his life. The Chua homeworld, however, had fully broken him. If he had not been on the Antares, had not been humbled beforehand, he knew that he would have just clapped his hands together and said that it was delightful. As the transmission from the Chua homeworld had come in, and the rescue effort had begun, he could only wallow in his own shame. He had profited directly from the Chua's suffering, the humans' suffering. Again he had tried and failed to convince his people, and again he had failed. Being on the Antares for him was torture. The lights were too dim. Every human in Chua looked at him with nothing more than loathing and contempt. His entire worldview had been shattered from the way he viewed the galaxy to his own place in it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow of Simmons standing over him, her voice cold with a lethal rage, hearing her voice echo in his mind, seeing the glint from flashes of light shining in her eyes. "We know!" Echoed in his mind in his sleep, the voice of the terrifying fleet marshal transforming into the sound of a vengeful god demanding compliance and promising retribution. Then he had watched the humans and Chua, who he knew were preparing to go to war with his people, celebrating the return of the HFY. Once more he had expected them to be integrated into the Terran Front, but as soon as he learned Simmons' offer to them, and what it had entailed, he had been called to his room to answer the latest message from his people. Once again his people had doubled down, the knowledge of the enslavement of the humans had been suppressed, and once more Tika found himself and his people standing against a Terran front that had every justification to declare war, to right the wrongs that had been done to them. All the while he knew something else. He knew that, after everything he had seen, that his people would lose. The Turinika had not been to war for nearly 2,000 years. His people were not ready for what the Terran Front could do, and after seeing what they had done to the Viral so far, he knew his people were not ready for what the Terran Front would do. He was afraid of the dark. Tika was absolutely terrified of it now, because now he knew the monsters were real. Simmons had shown him that, but the humans, the Chua, they were not the monsters. He was. He had refused to be one anymore. He had announced his intentions to his staff, who had squalled in rejection, all but 3. Kazia was the first to step to his side. Kikumot and Tsiki had stepped forward as well. Never in his most nightmarish dreams did he ever think that he would stand in front of Simmons and voluntarily have his plumage stripped from him, performing the act of Kavsa. He never thought that his staff would have ever compiled and transmitted the data package they had sent. He had never thought that he would betray his people, if only to save them. Simmons had changed that. The humans had changed that. He knew the terror of the dark. He knew fear for his people's safety. He understood the horror of war. And for the first time in his long life, he could truly look back at every interaction he had had with every species that had asked for help in their struggle for survival against the Vral, and truly understand their fear and desperation. Now he lay, his plumage stripped from him, his station revoked, his status removed, surrounded by a people who despised him. He wouldn't have it any other way now. He knew that they would listen now, if not to him, then to the civilian masses of the Conclave that would not stand for what they had done. He prayed to the Great Mother often now, shivering in the dim light, hoping that it would be enough. He had been wrong, and in his error he had sullied his own people. He had made them complicit. Even now he did not know how they would ever be forgiven, because right now he wasn't quite sure he could ever forgive himself. As he heard the broadcast calling out on the ship announcing 1 minute to jump, he felt a hand on his side and looked up to the human nurse. She was smiling at him. Not a smile born of malice or anger, but a genuine smile. She patted his side lightly, then turned to walk out of the room. For not even the 20th time since he had come on board Thermopylae, he was mystified by these people. The bridge of the Dampier was thrumming with music and the vibrations of the reactor, and Conrad leaned forward in his chair mount, his eyes almost feral as he looked at the empty space that was the Mandeville Point. He was positively chomping at the bit. Bats was positively roaring the lyrics to the song that was blaring over the ship's speakers. Rev and Dev sat side by side in their mounts, throwing their hands up in time with the pounding bass beat of the sound. Towns was the only one besides Conrad that was quiet, both of them looking towards the Mandeville Point with complete impatience. Conrad felt like jumping from his skin. Fidgeted, holding his hands over his headset and listening as if he were trying to hear secret messages in the music. They were ready. Their pulses were racing. The crew of the Dampier was positively vibrating. Conrad looked to the shipboard clock, seeing 13:30 displayed, and his head snapped a fidget, waiting for the word. They were going to run. They were going to chase. They were going to hunt. Vicky sat back, looking towards Jess and Kukat as they slept. Jess was in her chair, Kukat in her medical bed. Vicky glanced back at the block print on the paper and read it for the 5th time. She read the individual lines one at a time, cursing their existence. After reading through the message printed, she let her hand hang again. Kukat would be released from medical tomorrow, and both her and Jess still thought they would be boarding the Thumper to join the Velocore once more. Jess had talked non-stop about her quarters on the Velocore the past few days, how she just wanted to be back in her room. Kukat was equally excited. Only Vicky didn't share their excitement. They didn't know yet. They didn't know about their battlefield promotions. They didn't know about their reassignments. They didn't know the days of them working together were functionally over. Vicky looked down at her hand holding the paper again and felt like crumpling it. She had lost her crew. She had lost them not due to negligence or time. She had lost them to fame. Kukat was to be promoted to ensign and was to be the censor officer on the destroyer Hadrian. Jess was getting the same promotion, her station on the cruiser Victorious. Vicky? She was the sparkling new commanding officer of a destroyer that was arriving at Thermopylae in 2 days, the Quarrel. She never wanted this. She had turned down promotion after promotion that would take her from the cockpit of the Thumper, away from Kukat, away from Jess. She wanted to serve in this war in her own way, as a pilot, with the two who had made her life so enjoyable. Now, though, they were to be split up, and there was nothing she could do about it. These promotions hadn't come from simple seniority. They had come from high command, as had the orders. Tomorrow, when Kukat was released, they would be ushered into the hangar bay of the Barrowmore. They would all three be awarded the Star of Terra, then they would be reassigned. Tonight was the last night they would all be together. Vicky wanted to wake them up. She wanted to tell them, to give them a chance to process it. As she looked to Kukat and Jess, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She held up the letter again, reading the first few lines. Then she felt the sting of tears in the corners of her eyes. She looked away, her heart panging with sadness, and stared at the wall. The clock read 13:30. Corporal Brandy was sitting on the small rack with Janet Shippen sitting between his legs, using his thighs as armrests. They were both dressed for the first time in the last few hours, both of them staring at the clock. This close to the reactors, they could feel them beginning to spool up for the trip through hyperspace. When the news of the operation had come down, they had elected to spend as much time together as possible, which Brandy had enjoyed to no end, and he had made sure Janet had as well. Brandy had even taken some time to reach out to his sister Victoria, a rarity for them both, as since they were children they were often barely able to speak to each other simply due to schedules. He had even told her about Janet, and although he hadn't gotten a response from his sister yet, he already knew what she would say. Janet nestled back against him, but he could feel her body was stiff. Neither of them knew what the next few months were going to hold. Their time together might be constricted, in fact. This might be the last few moments they were together for quite a while. Brandy's ghouls were specialists, shipboarders. Chances are he was going to be extremely busy, as was she. He didn't quite know how he felt about Janet, but he did know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, he didn't want to be away from her. Judging from how she was acting, she felt the same as him, conflicted about her relationship with him, but not wanting to be apart. He knew what he needed to tell her, that he had to get up, that he had to leave. The ghouls were going to be assembled at 13:45, ready to board. Her unit was going to be prepared at the same time to begin taking on salvage. Her hands were like clamps on his legs, and from how tense she was, he wasn't going to get up until she was good and ready. The clock on the wall switched to 13:30. He stared at the clock, feeling like the clock was mocking him, when suddenly Janet leaned up and turned. Her hands took hold of his shoulders and she threw her body against his, her lips finding his own. Her arms wrapped around her frame and he tightened his grasp on her. Simmons spread her hands over the panel in front of her, looking at the table. 7 points connected the recently reclaimed Chua space to what was former Shesvi territory, and beyond that, the heart of the Vral Empire. Her lip curled in a wicked smile. On the digital display of the table, the hyperspace lanes, and more importantly, the avenues of attack her fleet was preparing to take. She held out her hand, all 5 fingers splayed over the lanes, envisioning the war as it stood now. The war to come. 7 hyperspace lanes, 7 systems branching out into 16, branching out again to another 20. The Antares herself was going to link up with the Baraki, and was set to simply plow through the next 5 systems to do so. Slowly she tightened her hand into a fist as she looked along the hyperspace lanes, seeing task forces lined up and ready to jump. Drones had already been sent through. The Vral had forces along the border, but nothing that could withstand what was to come. Her fleet was ready. She was ready. The Seventh Orion War was at the end of its first month, and had taken back 6 systems. The first moves of Operation Naked Sun would double that and exceed it, then double it again. She had already given her speech. Her task force commanders were ready. High Command had taken its time making this decision, and while she had railed against the delay, that didn't matter now. All along the front, individual task forces were joined into larger fleets, ready to jump into the next system and eliminate any Vral defenses. But unlike now, they simply would not wait. Naked Sun was to be a lightning strike to cut off as much of the Vral Empire as possible, to deny them their own space, to imprison them on their own worlds. Task forces were designed around 3 types of vessel combinations. Lighthammer task forces were comprised of corvettes and fast destroyers, the fastest vessels in the fleet, meant to take systems quickly, to devastate unprotected infrastructure, and to eliminate light resistance. Simply put, they were going to swarm into Vral space, determine pockets of resistance, and move on. They were going to rip entire sections of Vral space from them, calling in other task groups if needed. Thunder task groups were the primary capital fleets, meant to be sent into those pockets of resistance and neutralizing them, joining with the Lighthammer groups if needed. The cruisers, carriers, battleships, they all belonged to these task forces. Her own task force was called the Nova Task Force, and it comprised only the Antares and its sizable fleet escort. Simmons glanced up at the clock. The time was 13:29. She breathed in slowly. Then unbidden the thought came to her head, and she looked to the report from the 2 habitable planets that had been scanned by the drone cutters, the information having been relayed to her almost 20 minutes prior. She was not worried about the ground campaign. In fact, a reserve fleet from Thermopylae would be the ones to escort the landing ships from planet to planet that her fleet left behind in its wake, isolated and defenseless from the wider Vral Empire. Fleet escorting was no longer her job. Protecting ground invasions were no longer her job. Simmons was positively growling now, as her only job was to take her fleet and use it to rip the Vral out of the stars. Still, the thought nagged at her. On both of the planets that her fleet was set to overrun, there were Vral ships in orbit. On the first, there was evidence that the Vral had been bombarding a small area of the surface, extremely similar in size to the hole that now existed on Zvitia, the planet that even now was being integrated into the Terran Front. In the second system, it showed Vral ships in orbit. But whatever they were doing during the time they had taken the scans, whatever they were covering up, they didn't seem to have gotten to it yet. On the radiological scan of the planet, a massive bloom of electromagnetic energy painted a broad region of the planet blistering white. She had sent the images back to Earth, back to High Command, but no one seemed to know what was happening. The one thing that every analyst agreed on so far was that whatever the blooms represented, it meant nothing good. She took another long look at the radiological scan, seeing the intensity of the radiation, and her lip curled in a snarl. She couldn't think about that right now, but orders had already been given to notify her the moment that they had taken a planet that still bore the radiation signal. The Vral were being damned fastidious about it, though. She pulled her thoughts away from it, looking back to the hyperspace lanes. The slow grin entered her features again. She glanced at the clock. 13:30. Her hand took hold of the receiver next to her station, and she pressed the transmission stud, knowing that Hazard had already opened a channel to the wider fleet. "Commence,"